we started, originally as grain farmers. So that's what my family did. My granddad did that. My dad did. Our family did grain farming. And so when we switched to organic farming in 73, grain was our primary commodity. That's what we did very first. And grain is, wheat is the staff of life. I know it's gotten a lot of bad rap lately, but done right, wheat is still one of the best foods out there. And so we began early on in our early journey. We were growing wheat for Bob's Red Mill. And when that dried up, then we started selling grain. And so that was my very first thing that I sold. I went around selling grain. But I had no way to grind it to flour, although my mom did do a little bit in this little magic mill. Ground a little flour in that and sold it some local co-ops and stuff. But we didn't have any way to grind grain, so I had some custom ground at a mill up near Yakima. And so they would grind our grain and send it back, and it was always slow, and the quality was, mediocre at best. And so, but we were selling the grain and the flour, and but when I tried to get some higher quality flour, I found this mill up in Washington State. Oaksdale, this old guy, he had this mill called the Unifine mill that ground really fine flour. And so I was actually buying some flour from him for the high quality flour, even though it wasn't grain that we raised. It was stuff because, he was quite a ways away. But I bought some of the grain and we were selling it in these little 10-pound bags. And then, a few years later, so this would have been like in the 90s, I'm thinking probably late 90s, he said, well, I'm too old. I'm going to have to shut down. I can't do this anymore. We need to, sorry about that, but so I researched the Unifine mill a little bit and found out that there had actually only been 3 made. It was a invention that came from a guy that came from England, went to Washington State University in Pullman, Washington, and they had their innovation tech department build prototypes. So they built 3 prototype Unifine mills. And the cool part about Unifine is that it doesn't rub or grind the grain. Even a stone mill, it's rubbing it, and you're getting a lot of friction, and a lot of heat is involved in getting that ground. Unifine is a high-speed rotor, and as the grain comes in, it just hits it on a little nubbin, and it explodes the grain into a very fine flour. And so after I figured out, hey, I'm probably not going to be able to get it anywhere else, we ended up buying the mill from this old guy. So I brought it down and found out that the mill, was already getting kind of old. He had been using it for quite a few years. So I actually took it into a machinist and had them make blueprints off of the mill because the patent was already expired. He had done this way back right after World War II. And, it never took off because nobody wanted whole wheat flour at that time. It was all white flour. This does whole wheat flour. We can also do extraction flour with it, which I'll talk about a little bit later. So we bought the mill, and I had the blueprints done. And so then I got with the machine shop and had 3 of the wheels, the main part of the mill. I had 3 of them made by this machine shop. And so we ended up with 3 of those mills. But I did run the original mill while that was all happening. We went ahead and installed it. But I didn't have any place for it, so I installed it up we sectioned off a little piece of the farm shop were kind of the farm mechanic shop. So we cleaned part of that up, sectioned it off with the divider, and we put the mill in there and started grinding the flour with his original old mill while these were getting built. And it took off. People really liked the flour, and so we started selling more and more and more flour. And so eventually we said, well, we really can't. My brother wanted the farm shop back anyway, and we really shouldn't probably be grinding flour in the farm shop. That's probably not the best plan. So so we ended up building the mill that you see here in the background. We built just the one building, the one on the west side, and installed the mill in there. So that was the whole idea, is that we're going to go ahead and put the mill in this building, and we just kind of made a little, built the infrastructure around it. And that took a while because we had to do it kind of on a shoestring. We didn't have a lot of money at the time, and so most of that actually got built on site by family members. We built most of the stuff surrounding the mill, all the conveyors, the cyclones, the baggers, everything like that. And the mill itself, compared with what goes around it, there's a lot more in a milling operation. There's a lot more that goes around the mill than what the mill is itself. The mill is just one component of a fairly large operation. So then we started doing that for quite a while, and as far as I know, for quite a few years there, we were the only ones doing Unifine flour. And then there was a gentleman that had his uncle had been one of the ones that originally worked on the mill at Washington State University, and has his kind of retirement project. He decided he wanted to take on doing Unifine mills, and so I figured, hey, it's great. So I actually shared the blueprints and stuff with him, and he ended up building a few more of these mills. And so there are a few out there here and there now, but he introduced us to something that was pretty cool that he had done, and that was extraction flour. So an extraction flour is not very common in the U.S., but it's extremely common in Europe. Almost most of the flour is extraction flour there that folks use. But what extraction flour is you sift out all the bran as much as comes out in large chunks. The cool part is, though, that there is still, all the germ is still intact and in the flour, which is where all your nutrients like vitamin E are all in that. And there's small amounts of bran. Actually, the most digestible parts of the bran that are small, that can be fiber, are still in the product. So the color is going to be a little bit darker than like unbleached white flour, but as it bakes bread or cookies or whatever you're doing, it almost acts like white flour. So that's one of the cool parts about the extraction flour. So at Azure, but extraction flour, it was already, somebody had a brand on that, so we have called it Ultra Unifine. So in the Azure catalog, Ultra Unifine is the extraction flour that's sifted, and so that's been a big part of what we sell. We make our pastas out of extraction durum flour, out of the Ultra Unifine, and it makes some of the best pasta. So if you've tried the Azuroni pasta varieties, those are made out of that special flour, made with a special Unifine process and the sifting. So that works really well. The other cool part about the Unifine process in general, whether it's extraction or not, is that when that rotor breaks the grain and explodes it, there's no manual cutting force. So the oil molecules, like the vitamin E, and some of those more tender molecules are left intact. So the flour actually has better shelf life than standard whole grain flour by a pretty large margin. We've actually kept it 5-6 years. We usually only date it for 2 years at the most, usually 18 months to 2 years, but it'll last almost indefinitely. So that's a really cool part about that. Most standard flour is made with what's called a steel mill. And so a steel roller mill. So they run the grain through these rollers, and they get a whole huge series of them, and they get smaller and smaller. And what they are is rollers with a whole bunch of little tiny knives on it. So it's basically cutting the grain more and more and more and more, and it goes through hundreds of them, and it gets smaller and smaller and smaller. And so the grain is cut. So those molecules there's no chances are they're damaged. And also with white flour, in order to get the germ and all that out, they have to add quite a little bit of moisture. So they're getting it wet. They're peeling the bran off, basically. They're taking the germ out. And then they have to dry it back down and grind it. And then it has to sweat, what they call sweat. So you can't use super fresh white flour because it hasn't sweated yet. With Unifine, none of that applies. It's ground completely dry, which, grain keeps best dry. That's where your mold spores and these things get in, is when moisture is introduced. So if you can keep it completely dry, which the Unifine process does, you have a much safer and healthier flour. So that's another cool part about Unifine. So over time, we built that out. Now, 5 or 6 years ago, it became obvious that, there was a lot of folks that had celiacs and various forms of that. I'd love to talk about that, but we will move on. The whole, so we put in a second mill and second milling area in the mill. So there's several buildings over there now. One of those is dedicated to gluten-free. So we do now have a gluten-free Unifine mill. So we can grind things like rice flour. And rice, we grind rice, milo, corn, garbanzo beans, all of the gluten-free flours, teff, are ground on that side. The cool part about things like rice is rice flour ground in a stone mill or even in a steel mill is still gritty. It's very hard to get it all the way down, so it has to be soaked up. You have to have some pretty special cooking processes to make good product out of rice flour, whereas with the Unifine, it explodes it much finer, and it's almost like powder. And so the only difference is that it has more surface area with the finer flour. So when you're baking with it, it needs just a trace more water than standard steel cut flour. So over at Azure now, we do we're doing probably close to a semi-load a day of the flour out of between the two mills. We have the gluten mill and the gluten-free mill. And they, so we're grinding pretty much every day. Well, at least 4 days a week, sometimes 5 or 6, depending on the demand. And it's it's been a real blessing because whole grain flour and the healthier extraction flour, it's hard to come by. And so now that's a big part of the Azure product and the Azure product mix and the message. We also do the mixes, like the pancake mixes out of the Unifine flour. We make the pasta out of the Unifine flour. Those are all pieces of what's done here.